Most people who know Fawlty Towers think they already know which moment got the show into trouble. They picture Basil Fawlty, concussed and unhinged, goose-stepping across a hotel lobby while barking at a table of German guests, not to mention the war. That scene is loud, it's famous, and it's the one clipped and shared more than any other moment in British sitcom history. But here's the twist almost nobody clocks. That wasn't the scene that actually got an episode of Fawlty Towers pulled from the air. The real culprit was quieter, uglier, and far less talked about. A few lines delivered by a doddering old military man at the breakfast table, recalling an afternoon at a cricket match. Decades after they were first broadcast, those lines did something Hitler impressions and war jokes never managed. They got the episode physically removed from a British broadcaster's platform. To understand how a throwaway line from a minor character ended up being the thing that actually silenced an episode, you have to go back to where the whole show began. Not in a writer's room, but in a chaotic, real hotel on the English coast. In 1970, the cast and crew of Monty Python's Flying Circus needed somewhere to stay while filming on location in Torquay, a quiet seaside town on England's south coast. They checked into the Gleneagles Hotel, expecting nothing more than a bed and a decent breakfast. What they got instead was a masterclass in how not to run a hospitality business, courtesy of the hotel's owner, a man named Donald Sinclair. Sinclair wasn't simply unfriendly. He was suspicious of his own guests to a degree that bordered on theater. When Eric Idle left a briefcase sitting in the lobby for a few minutes, Sinclair didn't ask around to find its owner. He picked it up and threw it over the garden wall, apparently convinced it was an explosive device. When Terry Gilliam held his cutlery in a way Sinclair didn't approve of, the owner marched over to correct him as if he'd witnessed a crime. Complaints were met not with apologies but with open irritation, as though the guests were the ones causing problems by simply existing in his hotel. John Cleese found the whole experience strangely fascinating rather than just infuriating. He has talked for decades since about watching Sinclair with the curiosity of someone studying a rare species, amazed that a man could be so catastrophically unsuited to a job built entirely around making people feel welcome. None of it seemed to be an act on Sinclair's part. He appeared to genuinely believe he was running a tight, orderly establishment, even as nearly every decision he made, the thrown briefcase, the cutlery lecture, the contempt for anyone who dared to complain, pushed his guests further out the door rather than putting them at ease. It's the gap between how Sinclair clearly saw himself and how everyone around him experienced him that Cleese would later identify as the real engine of the comedy, long before a single line of Fawlty Towers had been written. Cleese kept notes on all of it. Years later, working alongside his then-wife and writing partner Connie Booth, he took everything that man represented, the paranoia, the social clumsiness, the desperate need to seem respectable while being anything but, and built a character around it. Basil Fawlty's tantrums were exaggerated for comic effect, but the bones of the character, the suspicion and the snobbery and the talent for offending absolutely everyone in the room, came directly from a real hotelier in Torquay. Sinclair died in 1981, 2 years after the second series of Fawlty Towers finished airing, and by most accounts went to his grave without ever fully grasping that he was the reason an entire nation could recognize Basil Fawlty on sight. Long before any of that, Cleese had grown up in Weston-super-Mare, an unusually tall and academically sharp child who excelled at cricket and boxing while quietly absorbing the absurdities of the adults around him. He trained briefly as a teacher after university places became scarce, eventually making it to Cambridge to study law, where a chance encounter with the university's Footlights comedy troupe redirected the entire course of his life. He couldn't sing, he couldn't dance, but he could make people laugh, and that was enough to get him in the door. At Footlights, he met collaborators who would go on to shape British comedy for the next half-century, including a young writer named Graham Chapman, with whom he would later help found Monty Python. By the time Cleese checked into the Gleneagles Hotel, he was already a recognizable face from Monty Python's Flying Circus, but the character that would define his legacy hadn't been written yet. That came a few years later, once the seeds planted by Donald Sinclair had fully taken root in his imagination, and once he and Connie Booth sat down to turn a bad hotel stay into a scripted disaster. Fawlty Towers premiered on BBC Two in 1975, and the reaction from critics was, to put it gently, unenthusiastic. Reviews described it as chaotic and difficult to follow, unconvinced that the frantic pace and farcical misunderstandings amounted to anything more than noise. One well-known critic of the time dismissed the whole premise outright, baffled that anyone thought a sitcom about an unpleasant hotelier screaming at his staff could sustain an audience's attention for half an hour at a stretch. The BBC itself wasn't sold either. After the first batch of 6 episodes, there was serious internal hesitation about whether a second series was worth making at all, and for a stretch of time it looked entirely possible that Fawlty Towers would quietly end as a one-series experiment nobody outside Britain ever heard of. What saved it was the audience. Viewers kept watching, reruns kept drawing bigger numbers, and word of mouth did what the initial reviews hadn't. It convinced people who'd skipped the first run to give it a try. Eventually, the BBC greenlit a second series, which finally aired in 1979, 4 years after the first. In total, only 12 episodes of Fawlty Towers were ever produced, and yet that small number is now treated as a complete, untouchable canon, frequently cited as one of the greatest achievements in the history of the British sitcom. In 2000, the British Film Institute named it the best British television show ever made, and a Radio Times poll of comedy professionals years later reached a similar verdict, ranking it above shows with vastly longer runs and far bigger production budgets. What audiences responded to wasn't just the slapstick, although there was plenty of that. It was the painful familiarity of Basil, a man convinced he was one good day away from running a respectable, refined establishment, constantly undone by his own snobbery, anxiety, and inability to read a room. Sybil, played by Prunella Scales, could flatten him with a single syllable. Polly, played by Connie Booth, was the only adult left standing amid the wreckage. And Manuel, the chronically confused Spanish waiter played by Andrew Sachs, turned every misunderstanding into its own small catastrophe. Behind the scenes, the show's 2 creators were going through a divorce by the time the second series was filmed, yet they kept writing and performing together until the project was finished, never letting the personal fallout bleed into the work itself. Of the 12 episodes, one in particular has spent 50 years sitting at the center of public debate: The Germans, first broadcast in October 1975. The setup is simple enough. Basil, recovering from a concussion after a mishap involving a moose head, is left in charge of the hotel just as a group of German tourists checks in. Terrified of causing offense, he orders his staff not to mention the war under any circumstances, then proceeds, almost immediately, to do exactly that, sliding into a rambling, increasingly deranged tirade about the Second World War that climaxes with him goose-stepping through the dining room in a grotesque impression of Adolf Hitler while his German guests sit in stunned silence. It's the scene most people picture when they hear that Fawlty Towers caused controversy, and for good reason. It's outrageous, it's been clipped and replayed for decades, and on the surface it looks like exactly the kind of thing that should have gotten a network nervous. But that's not actually what got the episode in trouble. Cleese has always argued, fairly consistently, that the joke in that sequence was never really about Germans at all. Basil is the butt of it. His ignorance, his anxiety, and his complete inability to do the one thing he set out to do, avoid an awkward subject, are what the audience is laughing at, not the war itself. Most viewers, in Britain and abroad, have generally agreed with that reading over the years. The scene that actually caused the episode to be pulled from a streaming platform decades later wasn't Basil's meltdown at all. Buried earlier in the same episode is a much shorter, much less quoted moment involving Major Gowan, the elderly, permanently confused long-term hotel guest played by Ballard Barkley. In a rambling anecdote about taking a date to watch a cricket match between England and India, the Major recalls her referring to West Indian players using a racial slur, then corrects her, clarifying which slur properly applies to which group of people, using a separate racist term in the process. The scene lasts only a few seconds. There's no music cue, no big visual gag, nothing that draws attention to it the way the Hitler impression does. For decades it simply sat there, an uncomfortable but largely unremarked upon piece of a much louder episode. It didn't stay unremarked upon forever. In 2013, when the BBC scheduled a daytime repeat of the episode, The broadcaster made the decision to edit the Major's lines out entirely, explaining that public attitudes toward that kind of language had shifted enough since the 1970s that it no longer fit a family-hour broadcast slot. Cleese's team consented to the edit at the time, and a later evening broadcast on the Channel Gold ran the scene unaltered. It was a quiet compromise that mostly escaped public notice. That changed dramatically in June 2020. In the weeks following the killing of George Floyd in the United States, a wave of reassessment swept through British and American media, with several broadcasters and streaming services pulling older content that suddenly read very differently in the new climate. HBO Max temporarily removed Gone with the Wind, and the BBC withdrew the sketch show Little Britain from its platforms entirely. Caught up in that same wave, the streaming service UK TV, which is owned by BBC Studios, announced it was temporarily removing The Germans from its catalogue, citing the racial slurs in the episode. For a few days, an episode of Fawlty Towers that had survived unedited reruns, video releases, and decades of public discussion was simply unavailable to watch on that platform. John Cleese did not take it quietly. He criticized the decision publicly, arguing that the BBC had completely missed the point of the scene. His position was that there are two ways to mock a bigoted attitude: attacking it head-on, or putting it in the mouth of a character the audience is clearly meant to see as a relic, a fool, an old fossil whose views the show was never endorsing. He accused the corporation of being run by people more concerned with managing headlines than understanding comedy. UK TV reinstated the episode within days, this time with an on-screen warning about offensive language and outdated attitudes, a model that other platforms had already adopted. BritBox and Netflix both kept the episode available throughout, attaching similar advisory notices rather than removing it. The episode has never landed the same way in every country that's watched it. In Germany, some viewers appreciated that the satire was aimed squarely at British neuroses about the war rather than at Germans themselves, and found Basil's meltdown funny precisely because it made the British character look ridiculous rather than menacing. Others, particularly those with family members who lived through or died in the war, understandably found the slapstick treatment of Nazi imagery uncomfortable regardless of who the joke was technically aimed at. In Britain, the debate has mostly centered not on the war material at all, but on the Major's lines, and on a broader question that has followed Fawlty Towers for years: whether putting bigotry in the mouth of an obviously foolish character is enough to neutralize it, or whether the words themselves carry harm no matter who's saying them or why. Cleese's answer has remained the same since 2020. He's described the Major as a man whose worldview the show was openly laughing at, not endorsing, and pointed out that satire only works if audiences are willing to recognize a fool as a fool rather than as a spokesperson. Critics of that defense argue that there's a meaningful difference between fictional cruelty and the use of an actual, real-world slur on screen, regardless of which character is saying it or how foolish they are meant to look. Some commentators at the time of the UK TV removal pointed out a different frustration entirely: that pulling a single old sitcom episode for a few days did little to address racism in any meaningful way, and that broadcasters eager to be seen doing something would have been better served investing in new opportunities for black writers, directors, and performers rather than quietly disappearing decades-old reruns. Both positions have stayed in circulation for years without either side fully winning the argument, which is part of why the episode keeps resurfacing in conversation every time streaming platforms reassess older catalog titles. The chaos audiences saw on screen had a real cost behind it. Andrew Sachs, playing the long-suffering Manuel, ended up genuinely bruised during filming when an early take of a scene involving Basil striking him with a frying pan used a real pan rather than a prop. Production switched to a rubber substitute afterward, but the damage from that first take was already done. Sachs also picked up minor burns during a sequence involving a kitchen fire that didn't go entirely to plan, and by most accounts simply got up, brushed himself off, and kept working. None of that visible strain made it onto the screen. The show's chaotic energy was a performance, not a documentary of what was actually happening on set, even when the line between the two blurred more than anyone watching at home would have guessed. Cleese and Booth's marriage ended during the gap between the two series, and yet they continued writing and performing together through the entire second run without the partnership visibly fraying on screen. It was the last time the two of them worked together in that capacity, and by all accounts they treated the final stretch of the show with the same professionalism that had defined the earlier seasons, regardless of what was happening in their personal lives. After the show ended, Booth largely withdrew from the public eye altogether, eventually retraining as a psychotherapist and stepping away from acting entirely, a sharp contrast to the path her former husband and co-star chose. Cleese went on to write and star in A Fish Called Wanda, lend his voice to the Shrek franchise, and remain a fixture of British public life well into his 80s, never shy about weighing in on debates over comedy, censorship, or the show that made him famous. The rest of the cast carried the show's legacy in quieter ways. Ballard Berkeley, who played the doddering, frequently confused Major Gowan, the very character at the center of the episode's later controversy, died in 1988, having spent his final screen years as a kind of beloved relic even before the world started reassessing his character's dialogue. Andrew Sachs continued working steadily after Fawlty Towers, appearing in long-running British shows before his death in 2016, following a battle with dementia of his own. Prunella Scales remained active for decades, appearing in acclaimed films and a long-running travel series with her husband, the actor Timothy West, before dementia eventually forced her retirement and, much later, her death in 2025. Despite lasting only 12 episodes across 4 years, Fawlty Towers has had a cultural footprint far larger than its runtime would suggest. It's been quoted, parodied, and studied in the decades since it ended, and "Don't mention the war" has become one of the most recognizable lines in the history of British comedy, instantly understood even by people who've never seen the episode it came from. The show's reputation has also done something unusual for a piece of 1970s television. It's grown over time rather than faded, treated today as a kind of foundational text for British sitcom writing rather than a relic people watch out of nostalgia alone.